Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat Shabbat, Shabbat Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat 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 Shalom. Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael Chai. Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael Chai. Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael Chai. Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael.
Okay, it's going. Good.
Okay, well, subject for tonight is the Sabbath, or Shabbat, as it's properly called in Hebrew. And just a little disclaimer, I guess, to start with, that this can be a pretty touchy subject with some people. Some people, as I've discussed this with them, they seem to get a little irritable. But you know, first of all, let's start with, at the top of your notes, there's a verse, 1 John 5:3, which I think kind of sets the tone for this whole teaching series. What I'm going to be giving you tonight is actually the first part of a 3-part series that I put together. And 1 John 5:3 says, "For this is the love of God, that we keep His commandments, and His commandments are not burdensome." It's a good verse to commit to memory, because it's really kind of should be our motto of life. You know, as we go through our life, we should keep in mind that if we truly love God, we're going to keep His commandments. I mean, Yeshua said, "If you love me, keep my commandments." And His commandments are not burdensome. As we study them, we find that it's not a burden. In fact, it's a delight to keep His commandments.
It's freedom.
And you know, what amazes me is it's ironic that people who believe in God, are members of the church, and profess to be followers of the Messiah, when you tell them that you're going to start keeping the Sabbath, they will actually try to talk you out of keeping one of God's commandments, which just amazes me. If you come to the average church believer and pick any one of the other 9 commandments, and let's say I came to the average church person and I said, you know, I've done the math and I've decided that I could provide better for my family if I steal things. So I've set aside 1 day a week to go out and steal things. They would be horrified. And they would do everything within their power to talk me out of that. But yet, when I come and I say, I've decided to keep the Sabbath. I've decided to be obedient to the 4th commandment. I get things like, I don't know if that's such a good idea, you know. Maybe you should pray about it. And, you know, maybe you should talk to a pastor about this. I mean, think of how ridiculous that is. You know, apply that to any one of the other 9 commandments. If I came to a church person and said, you know, I've purposed in my heart that I'm never again going to take the Lord's name in vain. How ridiculous would it be if they said, I don't know about that. You know, maybe you should pray about that. You know, maybe you should talk to a pastor about that. I mean, it's absurd. But yet the 4th commandment, for some reason, just really rubs people the wrong way. And I think it's really because the church has a real misunderstanding and some myths have crept into the church surrounding the 4th commandment, which is the commandment to keep the Sabbath. I've asked a few believers to tell me when they thought the Sabbath was instituted. And I got some interesting answers. One person said they thought the Sabbath was instituted after the flood, when Noah built an altar and started to make sacrifices. And another person gave me what's usually the standard answer, that Sabbath was instituted on Mount Sinai with the giving of the 10 Commandments. Neither one of those is correct. Okay? So hopefully tonight, as we go through this study, we can dispose of some of the myths and give a good understanding of when the Sabbath was instituted, what it means, why we should observe the Sabbath. So, in your notes, you can see I've left you hopefully plenty of room to jot down notes. And I've just put the verses that we're going to be going through in the order that we're going to be going through them. So let's start out by looking at Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, which says, "Thus the heavens and the earth and all the host of them were finished. And on the seventh day God ended his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made." Here is where the Sabbath is actually instituted, on the last day of the creation week. Even though the word Sabbath doesn't appear here, the first place in the Bible where we find the word Sabbath is in Exodus chapter 16. But when we get a little farther into this study, you're going to see when God gave the commandment to observe the Sabbath, he referred it right back to here, to Genesis chapter 2. We also see the reason God made the Sabbath was as a memorial of his creation work. Some people somehow have gotten the idea that the Sabbath was given as a memorial of the Jews' exodus out of Egypt, and that's not correct at all. Again, it's a memorial of God creating everything that we know and resting on the seventh day. And observing the Sabbath is our way of acknowledging that God is our creator and that we owe all that we have, every good thing that we see, to him. Now, let me ask you, here in Genesis chapter 2, where are the Jews at this time? That's right. They're not even in existence yet.
That's right.
Okay? There aren't any. In fact, Abraham, who was the first Hebrew, didn't even come along until about 1,800 years later after this. Okay? And Judah, where we get the name Jew from, came even farther along after that. So the first point I want you to know is that you cannot be called a Judaizer because you're keeping the Sabbath. Okay? Because the Sabbath was created long before there were any Jews. Prior to the fall of man in the Garden of Eden, before there was even any sin in the world, God created and instituted the Sabbath. In fact, the first person to observe the Sabbath was Almighty God himself. Okay?
He rested. Yeah.
Right. Now there's a book called The History of the Sabbath by J.N. Andrews. And in it he said, quote, "The seventh day, as hallowed by God in Eden, was not Jewish, but divine. It was not the memorial of the flight of Israel from Egypt, but of the Creator's rest." Some people try to say the Sabbath was not a divine command at this point by pointing out that there is no verse in Genesis commanding the patriarchs to keep it. But you have to understand, the book of Genesis was not in existence during the time of the patriarchs. You know, Abraham and Noah didn't walk around with the book of Genesis in their hand, reading it going, gee, what do I do today? Okay? The book of Genesis came along much later. But the book of Genesis does contain evidence that there was a law in existence during the time of the patriarchs, and instructions regarding modes of worship had been given long before the Ten Commandments. Okay? Now let's look at Genesis chapter 4, verses 3 to 5, which says, "In the process of time, it came to pass that Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground to the Lord. Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat. And the Lord respected Abel and his offering, but he did not respect Cain and his offering. And Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell." Now, where did Cain and Abel get the idea to make an offering? I mean, were they standing there out in the field one day going, look at all those sheep. Well, I bet you God would really like it if I